Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I've had the great luck of working in most of the world's small island developing states, and I think all but one in the Caribbean. And therefore, I feel very happy to talk to you about this today. It's been an amazing 2 to 3 years for all of the SIDS and in fact, for almost all countries. And I've been working with megatourism and the impact of tourism on, actually it was 140 countries, not 40, but with projects in about 80 of them. But what I've been doing for the last few years is running the program on sustainable tourism. And on, somebody else needs to turn off their, please turn off your own microphone. Or Doug, maybe you can shut off the others because I'm talking over someone. In any event, the program we've been running for the World Tourism Organization is to try and get people to understand the need for tourism to be sustainable and to understand its impacts on small island developing states and on coastal zones worldwide. The big issue is that tourism tends to overwhelm the places where it is most successful. So I'm going to give you a bit of a run on the impact of megatourism, and more so because it's the Caribbean, on cruise tourism as being one of the major social factors and economic stimuli for the area, as well as being a main issue regarding environmental degradation that goes along with the immense impacts. We've discovered that once tourism starts and is successful, it simply builds on itself. And we've been able to document the massive impact of large-scale hotels, resorts, and tourist enterprises in many areas, with major mega tourism concentrations in places like the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, and certainly on the coastal zones near them, such as Cancun. And even more importantly, and involving even more tourists, is that the Caribbean is now the nexus of the global cruise industry. And in fact, virtually all of the islands of the Caribbean, with one or two exceptions like Cuba, are directly the target of the cruise tourism. At the same time, we're finding growing interests in ecotourism and cultural tourism from the tourism industry. But right now, the world's largest industry is tourism, and cruises are the fastest growing component. And it's not odd to run into a place like St. Thomas and find 7 or 8 cruise ships the same day. And I'll show you some later that are even more significant in terms of the impact on communities. Tourism has now begun to return. And in fact, we are discovering that the bookings for tourism in the Caribbean are reaching 2019 levels for 2023 and may well meet and possibly even exceed them. But there are some changes that they are fostering as a consequence of the need for safety, security, and various other controls. Now, the cruise sector is really focused more than anywhere else in the Caribbean, with a few other impact areas in the Mediterranean and Alaska coast, now that Alaska has returned. But it is the fastest growing category in the leisure travel market. And we can note, however, we lost a few cruise ships in the last 2 years as older ones were retired. But quite frankly, it is still expanding. We are finding new builds happening already. And there are right now 323 large cruise ships in the market. That's one's carrying over 800 passengers, and some well over 6,000 in terms of new ones each. We're also noting a major expansion in the cruise market, and the numbers of bookings that are expected in the Caribbean in the fall or in the winter of 2023 will in fact be more than the numbers that were found in 2019. Now, the problem is that cruise ships are becoming more and more massive. They, some places they visit, such as Grand Turk, Roatan, as shown in the picture, San Blas Islands, tiny little areas, they can bring several thousand people at the same time to the same place. And when they disembark hundreds of tourists an hour, it can be a major issue of tourism management and to try and sustain the other attributes of the communities and the ecosystems that they visit. There are 25 new builds happening for delivery this year and early into next year. And most are to be added to the North American fleet. And again, I will note that there are about a dozen with over 5,000 berths each. And despite COVID, we're finding that the numbers of ships in the Caribbean tend to retain the same. The main thing that is done with the older ones is they are sold to Asia for other routes, and mainly about half of them as casino ships off China in the past. Is that going to happen now? Well, China itself has having different rules, and right now you cannot generally go on a casino ship out of Shanghai or out of Guangzhou very easily. It may happen again. But the world's biggest cruise ship is the Port of Miami, and right next to it is Fort Lauderdale. And of course, for those of you who know the Caribbean, you know that most of them come from right there. The biggest issue for the cruise industry right now is to stress onboard safety. They, up until about a month ago, were requiring pre-test and only allowing tested people fully vaccinated on the ships. I took one up Alaska last month, and it was still required to have tests immediately prior to it, and the only people allowed on it were people who were fully vaccinated. That is being reviewed right now, but again, it looks like the industry is resurrecting very quickly. So why is it so very popular? Well, right away, most of the larger cruise ships are providing very good value for money. It's the same as going to a mega resort or to Disney, that you're getting good value for money. Once you get on the ship, you are essentially taken care of. The value for money for under $200 a day on many of them, you get accommodation, all meals, all found, and even in some cases, free visits to short tours, or at the very least, the ability to get off every day into a neat new place, see somewhere you haven't seen, or see someone like the pitons at St. Lucia, which you have seen. You can go off, you can climb them if you wish, and you will be pampered for the whole week or 2 weeks, which is typical. You get fine dining, and essentially you are being in a floating resort. Not only that, but from the point of view of the countries, and particularly the smaller ones, it can be a very significant part of the GNP. $2.2 billion of a study found in 2009, and it went up a great deal from that point. $32 million by some calculations by 2019. And one of the interesting things, even in 2009, there was a specific study that noted that as a normal ship landing gives you $227,000 in passenger and crew expenditures in a single visit. And now that the ships are larger, and unfortunately we don't have more recent studies, it is going to be a great deal more significant. Have a look at this one. The ship in 1992, I was on this one in Grenada then, it had about 650 passengers. This one has 6,500. The expenditures as of 2018, which was the last reliable examination, shows for each of the major ports in the Caribbean, the actual amount of expenditures recorded there. And some of them are very large. Cozumel, 474 million. Cayman Islands, 224 million. Well, you can read these for yourself. And there are more breakdowns and details available. It is down for the last 2 years, obviously, because some of the ports actually banned any cruising or any visitors. And in fact, during 2020, there were many islands which were actually closed. Ones like Cuba, which didn't have cruising in the first place to any extent, closed its borders completely, as did most of the other islands, at least for short periods. In fact, we're writing a book right now on the impact of COVID on Latin American states. And it's showing the different approaches that every one made. Some essentially tried to become closed sanctuaries. But when we talk impact, this is the large ship day in St. Martin. There are 7 megaships there, 2 of the 4 largest ships in the world with over 5,000 bunks. And Philipsburg itself is about 7,000 people on a good day. And there are 26,000 passengers and another 10,000 crew on these ships. Now, not all the crew get off, but nearly all the people do. And therefore, the kinds of issues that a community has, and they all come on Wednesdays. And why do they all come on Wednesdays? Because they all leave Florida on the weekend. And they all arrive there, and then by Thursday or Friday, there's maybe no ships there at all. So how do you plan for that? How many taxis do you have? How many buses? How many toilets? The same issue comes with resorts. As the resorts go up, we're getting again data on them reaching the same levels as 2019 are in bookings right now. Are they going to be realized? We think so, as long as there isn't another rebound of COVID without vaccinations. So what happens is, once again, the rooms are very crowded in season, and the benefits and disbenefits of mass tourism become realized. So it comes back to some fairly fundamental questions. Do we have to travel? Well, have you got an alternative? There are only 2 countries in the world where most people are not allowed to travel easily, North Korea and occasionally Cuba. But if we do have to travel, what modes have the lowest footprint? And surprisingly, one of the modes that has one of the lowest footprints per person mile is these huge cruise ships, because they are so very efficient. But once again, if you're going to bring 5,000 people into a small community, you have many other issues. So the next question is, how can we reduce the footprint of tour visits? And that is not easy, because the boats can only go that fast. And if it's going to be more than, people do not like to travel more than 10 hours between ports. So they can get up the next morning in a port. So therefore, the limit of distance from one port to another is essentially around 200 miles or less. The other issue, and really the negotiation points for small communities like the Caribbean with the cruise lines, is not easy. I'll mention Alaska a little later, because in contrast, all of the jurisdictions are under the same management, and they have been able to negotiate a lot more conditions in terms of travel, of distance, of pollution, of and even plugging their ships in than is possible in the Caribbean. But even so, there are things being done by each of the cruise lines to lower negative impacts on the sites. And what I've been doing more is on lowering the impacts of people once they're there, and make sure that they really, just like day tourism out of resorts, don't all crowd at the same place at the same time. And that is very difficult. And in fact, while we have some successes in other countries, most particularly ones in some of the Spanish islands, like the Balearics and so on, where you can do a lot more cruise, more control of people, it's becoming difficult to transfer success stories culturally from some parts of the world to others. Even so, the notion is that we can try and reduce the negative effects of mass tourism. Starting with cruise planning, you can plan itineraries and you can stagger ships so they don't all arrive the same day in many cases, essentially getting them to go clockwise around Cuba as opposed to counterclockwise or some other variation, but so they don't all arrive the same day, and therefore the port doesn't have to build enough facilities to accommodate them. In terms of the vessels, there are major advances happening as we speak in terms of efficiencies of water, waste management, energy. And in fact, there is now a successful electric cruise ship running up and down the Norwegian coast. And that is indeed possible because they can plug it in at every site and it's all using non-carbon energy sources. In terms of emissions, all of the larger ships are self-contained completely with respect to black and gray water. And it's only really the stuff they use to wash the outside that ends up in the ocean. And the model that was started in Alaska is being accepted by most of the ships that have to hit Florida. And that means you cannot release any non-processed waste at all in the first 12 miles, and only very highly processed waste, gray water, beyond the 12-mile limit. Almost all of the stuff, in fact, goes back to Miami where it's pumped out. And there are also pumping facilities in some of the other Caribbean islands if the ship can't make it back in time where their tanks are full. Also, the question is, where are we going to get the water? Because for many Caribbean destinations, they are water short. And an extra 1,000 people going into Antigua or into Aruba is going to stress the water system. And therefore, the ships, in fact, do not load water in those destinations. And in fact, they supply water up for the passengers who leave. They walk off there with bottles of water that they bought in Miami. And we can get back to what that does for the economy locally, perhaps later in questioning. A lot of the work that we've been doing is with planning of itineraries and shore activities, and also visitor management when they visit the precious sites, the World Heritage sites, the beaches, the reefs, and a lot as well of education. We essentially have worked with the cruise ship companies to do education. When they sell you the snorkeling vacation, they spend a fair bit of time telling you about behavior when you are on the reef. And most of the people they are taking now, there are exceptions, we can talk about them, but are under some guiding control. And they're essentially told not to step on the reef, not to pick up things to bring home, what not to wear and what not to spill. So we are getting a lot of education in as ways to diffuse the impacts of people. Those of you who have been to Cuba may have gone Transat, and we worked with World Wildlife Fund to actually develop a little video you saw as you came into Cuba telling people about reef behavior and what they were not supposed to do and not to bring stuff back. And in fact, we borrowed that from them and sold it to Egypt to help with theirs on trying to save their reefs to the same basis. So the main kind of issues we've been dealing with destinations is first to attract custom, but not too much, to sustain the well-being of the destination residents. And we have an approach that generally works about participatory planning with them to ideally identify what they do wish to preserve and sustain, to develop the shoreside facilities. So often you will keep them off the dunes or off the reefs or off of the most fragile vegetation just by building structures so that they walk through the mangrove on a walkway rather than trying to stomp through it. And a lot of the ones too are to try and push the shoulder season so that everybody doesn't arrive there during break week in March. They actually spread it across several months. And again, pricing is a game that we play often in that industry and mostly in the tourism industry. If you want to visit here in Antigua, you are going to get a cheaper price at the nice hotels, not in February. Try late March, early or before Christmas. Major use of price incentives and disincentives. You cannot afford to be there over Christmas in a lot of these Caribbean resorts. And you will, if you monitor the actual costs of when they are selling cruise vacations, it's going to cost you an awful lot more in mid-February or over Christmas. But right now is a very good time. Now that say wait another month before the hurricane risk is not there, and you're going to get some of the cheapest prices in both resorts and in cruise ships anywhere in the world. And these are some of the tools that we use to try and limit the number of people coming to those, in fact, that a small island destination can handle. But that is not done very easily because it's very negotiable by the government with its own tourist sector and with the airlines and with the cruise ships. And a lot of small islands who don't work together don't always have very much leverage. The Caribbean group has tried to work together, but it doesn't take, it only takes one to break from the group before they are individually negotiating with the airlines or cruise lines or hotel groups. How am I doing time-wise? I'm about on target, about a few more minutes. One of the new things that's happening is build your own resort. The cruise ships are building their own, this one in Grand Turk. The idea being that you may think you're off the ship, but you're really not. And in many cases, the actual shore facilities are managed, owned by the cruise ships or in liaison with other enterprises that run essentially the shopping mall where you land the ship. And that is not necessarily providing the experience that some people want. However, for others, it's perfect. You can lie on the beach, you can have yourself a margarita, and you can watch the ship from the beach. Why will this not move? Here we go. Doesn't want to move. There. Okay. However, again, I'll just make the point that if you're going to have a lot of ships in, you've got to have a lot of capacity to handle them. And the real problem is how much do you build in anticipation of serving the numbers that come. Physical limits can do. If you only build two docks, you normally don't get a lot more than 2 ships, although some will anchor off. Socially, do you want masses in your market, or do you want really to limit the numbers who come and share your facilities in your community? In economics, how much can we build? And I always come back again to how many toilets do you want to have on the dock? And in fact, we actually held, interestingly, more in Alaska than and in the Maldives, questions of how much to build for people in order to really limit the people to the amounts of infrastructure rather than building a great deal more. Although again, Alaska is being challenged right now from the resurgence of their cruise industry. Ecologically, can we in fact direct where people go? Cozumel has a problem because you can essentially climb off the cruise ship and get on the reef right there. They do not have the control that they have in some other places where if you want to go out on the reef, you actually have to get on to a small cruise, a small tour, and they have some degree of control on it. In Bonaire or Aruba, you just climb off the road anywhere and you are on a reef. So it has given them fits to try and control the negative actions of some people who want to come home with a piece of coral or a starfish. And that's why when we usually go into these small destinations, we work with them on the idea of what they really mean by well-being. Do they just want more tourists or more money? And the question always comes up, well, can't they just send the money? Do they have to come? And in fact, that's actually run into that question in a few places. The new one is trying to add better ecotourism and environmental tourism to the offer, bringing people in to stay longer, to do more, to look at the ecology. And once again, ecotourists generally do not tend to be destructive of the environments they go at. If any of you have ever been to Trinidad and didn't see the Asa Wright sanctuary, it's one of the world's best bird sanctuaries. And as long as you don't mind getting up at 6 in the morning to see the birds, it is really one of the best experiences you will ever have. On the other hand, some people do not really consider the effects they have on the environment. And the tourism industry, among others, has been a really negative stressor on natural environments, and I might say on communities too, where waste and where really they're pushing them off the docks so that they can see something, and the fishermen can't even find a place to park. So it's been a major issue for us in developing the indicators and the tourist solutions. So one of the key issues that people say, well, we want more tourism, we want more cruise ships, we want more visits, is they often do not understand that all of the benefits do not actually land in the communities where the people come to for a short vacation or when they visit in a cruise. We're finding that in the Caribbean and in other areas like Alaska or South America, a lot of the places close in off season. And so you'll find a lot of people, in fact, some actually migrate where they move with the ship. I remember talking to someone in Florida, and they said, well, we're about to get onto our RV because we're driving to Skagway because that's where we're working for the summer. So it's a very, very mobile industry. It's also very vulnerable. If you end up with something, and COVID was a case in point, but also if you end up with civil strife or if you end up with a hurricane, it really, the cruise industry goes away instantly. It doesn't even bring its ships there for several months until it's fixed. And same on the shore zone tourism, that people will not go to a destination. And the other negative aspect of this is that the reputation lasts much longer. People may note that there has been destruction happening in a place like, for example, US Virgin Islands. And a lot of people will, even 2 or 3 years later, choose not to go there because they believe it's still wrecked. I was in Puerto Rico last year, and it was before the current hurricane. And there was a lot of evidence of places still in rough shape because they had not yet repaired it from a year and a half earlier. And as a result, the tourism industry was down significantly, and was due to both COVID and to the destruction, even though it was reasonable and feasible for Canadians and Americans to get back into Puerto Rico. And in fact, Puerto Rico was a marvelous success story in terms of how it handled COVID. It put in some of the most strict and stringent regulations. You weren't really able to go there unless you were vaccinated. You had to be pre-tested unless you were American before you got in. And as well, you had to walk around with a little card explaining exactly when and how much COVID treatment you had for them to allow you into restaurants. So there were ways where some of the islands, in Puerto Rico, just as a case in point, tried to advertise themselves as a sanctuary destination. So we're back to, therefore, cruise ships are analogous in many ways to a big hotel or a big resort, except they can float away if they have to in a rush, and in fact can be repositioned. And a few, in fact, were used around the world as residents, as places, as were hotels for people who were affected by COVID, where they had to stay in sequestration, where they wanted to get away from their families to protect them if they were working in the health industry and so forth. But the big issue is how to reduce the footprint of hotels and cruise ships due to the vast numbers of people who go. And once again, I'm going to make a bit of a PR statement that the cruise ships are now a lot more efficient than they used to be. And so are the new hotels. They are, as they retro build hotels, think of one in the Bahamas, where I was at a conference, and they unfortunately began, it was on sustainable tourism. And I was in the hotel, and it had probably the worst energy use of any hotel I have been in. They kept the inside very cold. The water was condensing on the glass roofs and on the windows. And the only way you could be comfortable was in your hotel room, keeping the door open and the air conditioning on, because they would sort of offset each other. If you didn't have the air conditioning on, you were going to be at about 35 Celsius. And if you did have the air conditioning on, you were going to be at about 10 Celsius. And the only way to get it in anywhere near 20 to 25 degrees was to leave both on. And that became a subject of discussion for the conference. It was really very bad PR for the hotel, whose name I will not mention. At the same time, new cruise ships are a lot more fuel efficient, using cleaner technology, and I mentioned waste management. And MARPOL has been very powerful in terms of controlling what cruise ships are allowed to do, and it is now monitored far more effectively, particularly in the US. The US actually leads a lot of that. And the Caribbean is definitely one of the ones where MARPOL-based ships are pretty well all of them. And I mentioned the Alaska model. Alaska has been a leader because it has about 10 different ports in Alaska. And when the cruise ships say, well, if you force us to use better technologies, we will just move to another port. Well, no, you won't, because all of the Alaska ports are moving in lockstep. And the Alaska model, therefore, one thing that I think has been particularly productive is when the ships land, they turn the motors off, and they are immediately on shore power. And that is indeed possible in Alaska because they are all powered by renewables. It is much bigger of a challenge in the Caribbean because virtually all of the power, even if they did plug in, would be coming from fossil fuels. And until that changes, that option is not allowed. At the same time, cruise lines do now all have their own environmental policies in practice, and they on paper are very good. In practice, they're okay too. And they in fact have their own environmental officers, and they publish their own. Each of them are a bit different, but by and large, they're doing the same thing. They're reducing the footprint impact. In the town centers, it's always going to be a difficult thing. The town centers were originally not designed with tourism in mind, and therefore the local structures that may have got people to come in the first place, many have been replaced by essentially tourist kitsch. The impact on some islands is brand new ports, places like St. Thomas, St. Kitts, where all the things are targeted retail shops. New dedicated port facilities are essentially a shopping center built on and a dock in places like Turks and Caicos or Costa Maya. At the same time, it's been a challenge to get the resorts and cruise companies to contribute to the sustaining of the community themselves, and also to contribute to the shore facilities and to the environmental protection of the places that they take tourists to. And tourists can have a very significant impact, whether they're from cruise ships or from the resorts. Cruises are a little more intensive because most cruise ships land for 12 hours or less. Nearly everybody leaves the ship. And in many cases, there are very popular tours within a few hours. But what happens is it concentrates an awful lot of people at a very specific time. If you're going to go to Cartagena, Colombia, Juan Valdez is having his little party on top of the hill and sharing people coffee for only about 2 hours of the day. And there are 50 tour buses there from the 4 ships that are in that day. They concentrate visits in specific places and specific times. Ocho Rios, same issue. You get the two or three ship day there, and everybody wants, for Dunn's River Falls is by far the most popular trip out of Dunn's River Falls. It's only a short distance away, but everybody comes at the same time. On a day when there's no cruise ships in, of course, nobody's coming, or very few. And the tour operators, the people who provide things, really have very little to do. It's trying to control for daily rush and for sensitivity that is, and also seasonality that is a real problem. I'm going to give one example before I quit in about 5 minutes on this stuff. But usually tours focus within 2 hours travel, even if they are shore, if you're staying on shore or when you're staying, and certainly if you arrive from a cruise ship that's going to leave shortly. Everybody arrives at the same time. All of the people come in buses and they have to have a place to park them. All of them will need guides, and we get them to toilets. And so I'm going to go to this very specific one, which is one of the most extreme. A simple site excursion to a wonderful place, Lamanai, which is a Mayan temple that has been excavated. It has a beautiful little community next to it. There's a beautiful river to ride up, and the ships arrive. Because the ships have to tender in Belize, they arrive at the shore from the tenders at about 8:30 or 9, in which case you have to jump immediately onto the bus to head for the new river. And takes a couple of hours to get on the fast boat. You roar up a river to the point where, if you're lucky, you can spot something on the shore with binoculars. There are some lovely animals along the thing, things like sloths and birds and things, but it's pretty hard to see at high speed. You visit the Maya ruins. The nice little local community provides you with a very pleasant lunch. And then you roar through the ruins, go back to the bus. It roars back as fast as it can on the local roads, lands at the dock about 4 o'clock, and you better get on the tender fast because it's going back to the ship, the last one, at 5:30. Okay, you have no time to shop. You really have no time to really appreciate much at all. And yet this is one of the most popular tours for the cruise industry when they take people to Belize. This is probably one of the more extreme ones, but you then ask yourself, we're providing the facilities. Where do the people even get to spend some money other than for lunch? Do they have time actually to walk around the city? Do they have time to see the country other than from a high-speed bus? So that has been a real cruise planning issue for a lot of the lines. We've been working with them as well to come up with a range of tools that are possible. If you visit Guyana, definitely Gayatur is the signal wonderful site. Cruise ships don't go to Guyana. Nothing or very little of the lovely ecology of the country is accessible from the port, and the port is not really suitable for cruises. However, if you are there, you have lovely location that you can get into by plane. And we've been working with them, and as with other ones in places which are more accessible, to look at setting up quotas, using marketing, getting limits to the number of people allowed in, putting new hardened paths in so people can't fall off the edge, to really manage them when they're on the path, giving them a chance not to pick things and not to take things home. And even things as effective science signage. Don't step over this cliff, please, because you're going to end up in the Caribbean in a few days. The issue really is to manage the tourists as they impact the precious sites. There are a few emerging success stories now. I'll just whip over them quickly. They are in place. Things like the Florida Caribbean Cruise Association has a lot of training initiatives going on with communities, helping them preserve things, making contributions to the natural preservation of places of fragile sites in the Caribbean. So I'm going to end shortly with a few larger questions then. Tourism industry is very resilient in some ways. It certainly is for the cruise ships because they can sail away to a different place. But it is not resilient to the kinds of issues that we have run into, like COVID, like any kind of health issues, like hurricanes, any risks of economic dislocation, anything that in fact people will not travel in response to terrorism, even when it's happening in other places, because it is difficult to understand how little people know about other places. So they hear that something is in the Caribbean, they may just avoid the Caribbean. If they hear that something is in Asia, they may avoid Asia. So it is a very vulnerable industry and it can change in minutes. It's also very subject to politics. If a country doesn't like another country, if Cuba comes to mind, it becomes much more difficult for that nation to manage its tourism industry, to manage who comes, who goes, to sell goods, and so forth. So these are always particularly sudden in the tourism industry. We have a very specific study when there was terrorism at the pyramids in Egypt a few years ago. And we have, we know that a plane on the way from Dusseldorf to Cairo turned around in midair and had them booked and taken instead to a resort in Cyprus by the time they landed. And it took, after the terrorists' attacks at the pyramids, it took about 5 years for them to reestablish their industry. And that's always been a consideration in terms of how to create a robust and sustainable tourism industry. So sustaining tourism is really an ongoing challenge. It's something that always requires attention. That's why we started the Sustainable Tourism Program a few years ago with the UN World Tourism Organization, and why we're continuing to do it. And a brand new program that's happening now is we're establishing observatories of sustainable tourism around the world. 46 of them now. Unfortunately, there's none in the Caribbean. There's one going in Florida at the Everglades, and there's a couple in Latin America, but at the moment, I don't think any are underway in the Caribbean. A small island in the Caribbean would be a wonderful observatory of sustainability. And I know the UN World Tourism Organization would be prepared to contribute. In fact, they often need to go places to help do it. I didn't want to shut that off. What happened to my loud? Put it back on. There we go. One. So that said, thank you for listening to me. I would be delighted to answer questions, and I will, in fact, turn this off at this point.
Thank you very much, Ted. That was a interesting talk, and I must say, some beautiful photography as well in your.
Well, that's what I do for fun.
In the pictures that you've provided. So at this point, as Ted said, he's quite happy to answer any questions. Please feel free to turn on your camera or your microphone and camera and ask questions that way. Or if you prefer, you can type it into the chat function. And I see that we have one question already on the chat, so I'll just read it out. There are many coral diseases in the Caribbean, like the emerging stony coral tissue loss disease. Are cruise ships disinfecting rental snorkel gear between visits? And are they educating visitors about it?
The answer is no, because they are not allowed to take snorkel gear from one place to another. They don't to move gear. The main issue, maybe actually, I don't think they're doing a lot of disinfection when they put their tenders down. But by and large, you are renting gear locally. You have a local guide. If you do it in Cozumel, if you do it off Belize, if you do it in Aruba, it's different stuff. If you insist on bringing your own, no, there are no controls right now. So I could easily go snorkeling off the dock in Bonaire, and then use the same a few days later off St. Lucia. So no, that is not under control, and that is probably a legitimate issue. It is not. It is mentioned by certainly in terms of taking any things like coral from one place to another, but it is not, to my knowledge, happening. It might if there are particular snorkel excursions going, small ship excursions, but I'm not aware of that. And it's a legitimate point. We tell people to, well, we tell them don't even step on the reefs. We usually encourage them to do drift diving managed by people who will take them to a place like Boko Reef, off places where really they can just float on the current. One of the best ones around is off Cozumel, where you can simply, you're only 8 to 10 feet above the reef for a very long distance. You can just lie there floating and watch it as you go by. The big issue we've got, like in Cuba, we're trying to stop people from touching the reef at all. And we've been doing some education through Transat, actually was helping to do that, and the World Wildlife Fund. So there are efforts to try and stop people spoiling stuff. It just isn't as good as we would like.
We have a follow-up question from Simone Williams. Would it be difficult to provide a disinfecting station on board or before they board?
Well, certainly the people providing the small, the little fish boats that take people out to the reef could, I guess, in each country. But nobody's taking stuff on, and I mean the cruise lines do not generally rent you stuff, take it from place to place. If you're renting any equipment to go snorkeling, to go on a tour, you're usually renting it from the guy on the boat who's taking you there, on the small boat. So I guess you could, but I'm not sure. We're just trying to disinfect people entirely from COVID, not anything else these days. Trying to make sure they don't bring any viruses on for the people. But yes, it's a legitimate thing. I mean, quite frankly, if they were using the same boats in different places, I would be asking them, do they in fact disinfect the entire water system, cooling system on the boat? But we're not. The cruise ship comes in, and some of the people on the boat go to a local provider of a small tour boat that will take them to the reef that they go to every day or every few days with tourists. So that I don't think is going to be a significant issue. I think if some boat was going from St. Thomas over to St. John, maybe they should be told to disinfect the boat before they went to a reef on a different island.
Any other questions for Ted? I actually have one for you, Ted.
Sure.
And you mentioned that, for example, Phillipsburg at getting 6 megaships on a Wednesday. I'm familiar with in the Galapagos, and I recognize that it's a very different structure. First of all, it's one jurisdiction. But they have a very strict scheduling process. So that only a certain number of boats, and the boats there, of course, are much smaller, can come into a port or dock off a location at any one time. What is the necessity of having all these cruises leave Miami on a weekend? And wouldn't it be possible for even sort of minimal coordination among some of the islands to simply do some scheduling such that you don't have that kind of situation arise?
Yes, would be possible.
Why is that not to the advantage of the islands to try to coordinate that?
They have tried, and they broke it up. St. Vincent and Grenada both got off the ship at one point when they were actually putting something together to try and do that. But the other issue is that for the largest cruise ships, and a lot of them are the mass ones that are settling vacations, everybody leaves home Friday night, gets on the boat on Saturday or Sunday, takes 1 week, and then comes back to port on Saturday or Sunday to fly back to Peoria or wherever they come from. There is no other place. I mean, the fact is that St. Martin is exactly 3 days east of the same thing happens, by the way, in Cozumel. They essentially there are no ships in Cozumel on Sunday. There's virtually none. I mean, there are some that go around other places, but the mass ones are essentially selling to an audience that wants a 1 week tour. And that's the problem with tourism. So the more they broaden it, the specialty ships, if you get on one of the small ones, yeah, they'll go to different islands. In fact, most of them will, in fact, avoid ones like St. Thomas or St. Martin. They'll go instead to St. Bart's or to Bequia or somewhere like that. But those are little boats. They're only about 300 people, and you're paying $10,000 a day for them as opposed to $200 a day.
But wouldn't even just a simple change in docking fees, wouldn't the market take care of itself? I mean, if it costs the boat 2 or 3 times as much to dock in St. Martin on a Wednesday as it did on a Friday, wouldn't ultimately the cruise cost convince people that their holidays should run from Wednesday to Wednesday instead of from Saturday to Saturday?
Yeah, they're trying a bit of that in Alaska because they have a little more control and they do talk to themselves. And yes, there are some ships that don't leave Seattle or Vancouver on the weekend. You can go one that'll leave on a Friday or Monday. Even so, the big day for Juneau is a Wednesday. And Ketchikan is either a Thursday or a Tuesday, whether they do it going up or going down. The market, the other issue is that Antigua is riding it a bit. They're selling berths, but there's really only 4 berths possible in Antigua. And they are, I believe, selling berths to take some of the ones away from St. Martin because it's really a very short distance further. The day Cuba comes back, everything changes. There's some, they could easily do a few ports in Cuba to break it up. But right now, Cuba is blocked because they won't allow Cuba in. They tried for a few days there before Trump got rid of it. And both Santiago and Havana are really appropriate, suitable ports, and they did have a few berths. A few ships did go there. Fred Olson did for a bit before they were banned from going anywhere by the U.S. Under the Jones Act and under various other legislation, a ship that touches Cuba is not allowed to go to any port that accepts other cruise ships. And in fact, they have pretty well sterilized the Caribbean for everybody. There's 1 or 2 ships have tried past. Again, Fred Olson was the one, but you would have to go all the way across from Britain or France to Cuba, do a couple of ports and then go back. You're not allowed to stop anywhere else in the Caribbean, because if a port accepts one that has touched Cuba, they are not allowed to accept any one that touches the US. So it has been coercion. Yes, we know I'm not currently up I've attended a couple of webinars like this on what the influence of COVID is. But the other one has to do with how they coordinate. They have coordinated fairly well in terms of COVID, and they've done that with the airlines. And the cruise ships are coordinating to some extent, although again, Norwegian broke away and allowed non-vaccinated travelers on before others did. And I don't know if that has broken the cabal or not. But it is very much on my website. There's a little thing on tactics for negotiating for cruise ports. It's on one of the ones on the things available on my website. We wrote it up just for Cuba at the time, but not easy to. The cruise industry is very large and very mobile, and it is my understanding that at one point they were asked to make contributions to port maintenance and things for Grenada. This is quite a long time ago. And very shortly thereafter, they said no, and the cruise ships just went elsewhere. I'm not sure if they're back now, but it's a power struggle, and being very mobile.
Do we have other questions for Ted?
Well, I still think saving the reefs is a very good idea. And in fact, we've been lobbying with the World Wildlife Fund to get things. In fact, if you go on a cruise ship these days, there is at least one thing on your television available, should you wish to watch it, about the reefs of the place you're going, or about other very fragile ecology. And the biggest problem is they are able sometimes to brief people going on tours so that they are told what not to do. And certainly the stuff is generally available now for the people who get on the ship. But if you've got 3,000 people getting on the ship and they're racing for the casino and bar, it tends to be a little less attractive to watch something about the sea creatures. So it's and by the time they're on the 8th drink, they're not really too interested.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is a challenge.
Well, if we don't have any more questions for Ted, I see we're actually after the 9 o'clock time. I want to thank you, Ted. That was a really interesting talk. It maybe raises as many questions as it answers, but clearly there's a lot of work that's still needed to be done to solve.
That was intentional, because
Yes.
we see sustainability in this industry to be an ongoing challenge, and if we don't get it right, it's going to screw itself.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely correct. So I just want to alert people that our talk next week will be by Roger Pulwarty, who's from the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration in the US. And he will be talking on strategies for building resilience to climate change in Caribbean small islands. So once again, Ted, thank you very much for your presentation. And thank you to all of those of you who've joined us for today. And I hope you'll join us for the talk next week. Bye for now.
Bye.